Jason has written a truly phenomenal book, and I'm not just saying that because he's a friend. The book, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, has everything. Historical sweep, graceful writing, and engaging real-life characters, and, of course, tremendous relevance. It's about the great migration of masses of people that's been taking place around the world, not just the highly politicized matter of immigration across the U.S. southern border that Trump is so fixated on, but the vast movement of workers and families occurring in many places and transforming the politics, economics, and culture of countries. Jason centers his story around the personal saga of a woman named Rosalie and her remarkable journey from a Manila shantytown to a Texas community. But the book, in addition, tracks 3 generations of Rosalie's extended family across multiple countries, all the while setting their search for better lives in the context of the epical rise in global migration. The story of how Jason, who's a longtime New York Times reporter, came to write this book is quite fascinating in and of itself, and I'm sure he's going to tell you all about it in a minute. But let me just say that it began more than 30 years ago, and it's not often that a work of journalism can have such a lengthy gestation period. In this case, it's given Jason an unusually long term, as well as quite intimate and informed view of his characters. Rosalie, for instance, was a 15-year-old schoolgirl when he first met her in the Philippines, and today she's a nurse, wife, and mother in her late 40s in the United States. Jason came to the issue of migration through the subject of poverty, which is a subject that's interested him since his school days. When the New York Times hired him, it was to cover social policy, and for his first book, American Dream, which was published in 2004, he spent 7 years following 3 Milwaukee families on and off the welfare rolls. A few years earlier, he won the George Polk Award for his reporting on the welfare system, and before that, he was twice finalist for the Pulitzer in Deadline Reporting. In 1995 for coverage that focused on the condition of the poor and federal government actions affecting them, and again in 1998 for coverage of the successes and frustrations of the national effort to reform welfare. The stories that Jason has always enjoyed writing most are ones in which he can deeply immerse himself and come up with extensively reported, character-driven narratives that illuminate larger issues. His new book is a masterpiece of just that kind of thorough reporting, insightful analysis, and eloquent writing. Please join me in welcoming Jason DeParle.
Thank you. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat for the Filipinos here. Magandang gabi. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter living in Manila with an interest in shantytowns, the scrapwood mazes that cover the city and much of the developing world. I called the country's most famous nun who lived and worked in a shantytown called Levarisa. I didn't say so, but I was hoping to move in. Sister Christine Tam was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and busy on a commission drafting a new constitution. "Call me back in a few months," she growled. Hoping for a quicker audience, I told her I'd been working with another nun in her order, but apparently they weren't friends. "That's a mistake," she said. "Meet me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in front of the Manila Zoo." "Are you CIA?" she said when I arrived. "Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you?" She let me know that living with the Levarisa family wouldn't work. "The poor are magnificent people, unlike the rich," she said. "But Americans need toilets, and most homes in Levarisa lack them. A family would feel a need to buy me expensive food. I'd be a burden." Sister Christine talked on, denouncing the American military bases and American corporations. Then she waved a hand above her head and said, "That's all up here," meaning politics. "Somehow we need to build links between the first and third worlds." If I returned in a few days, she'd see what she could do. so I came back thinking she would have used that time between our meetings to approach a family or two. Instead, she led me into the alley and auctioned me off on the spot. I knew just enough Tagalog to know the first woman she talked to was horrified, and so was the second. And the third, Tita Comodas, was simply struck mute. With her thin patience exhausted, Sister Christine stalked away. "If you don't want him, pass him on to somebody else," she said, "and don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, that's too bad." I don't know who was more frightened, Tita or me. We drew a crowd. "Ask him if he eats rice," someone shouted. "Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina." Tita stalled for as long as she could, then gave in to what she took to be Sister Christine's request and offered me a spot on her floor. I was interested in slum life, not migration, but migration was how the family survived. Tita's husband, Emmett, was 5,000 miles away, cleaning pools in Saudi Arabia, while Tita was home raising their 5 kids on the money he sent back. All 5 kids grew up to become overseas workers too, and they're part of a large extended family spread out across the globe. Just about everything that could happen to a migrant family, good or bad, has happened to one of them. The member of the family I came to know best was Tita's daughter, Rosalie. She used her father's remittances to make the long leap from the slums to nursing school and spent nearly 2 decades working in the Persian Gulf, mostly Abu Dhabi, all the while hoping to get to the States. She was just about to give up when a hurricane slammed into Galveston, Texas, with Katrina-like consequences. A sixth of the city never returned. Unable to lure enough nurses back to the struggling island, the local hospital finally recruited abroad, hiring 20 foreign nurses to open a new ward. Rosalie had her chance. She arrived in the summer of 2012, and her husband Chris and their 3 young children soon followed. Eager to see immigration through their eyes, I tagged along. Their period of adjustment coincided with the rise of Donald Trump and a surge of conservative populism that regards assimilation as a failure and immigrants as a threat to jobs, culture, safety, fiscal health, and national security. The Villanueva story offers a retort. With a house in the suburbs and kids on the honor roll, they achieved in 3 years a degree of assimilation that used to take 3 generations. And they did so, moreover, in Metro Houston, a bastion of pro-immigrant sentiment deep in red state America. The old rodeo town's embrace of Hindu temples and Viet Cajun cuisine is a hint, perhaps, that immigration is less divisive in daily life than it is in national politics. In a country of 44 million people, 44 million immigrants, no family stands for the whole. The Villanuevas merely stand for the large part missing from the presidential Twitter feed. Rosalie's experience also happens to be the greatest anti-poverty success story I know. It began in the early 1950s when a young boy on a distant island was smuggled aboard a crowded ferry for an overnight trip to Manila. Rosalie's father, Emmett, was recently orphaned, and a distant relative visiting the province had agreed to take him home. Home was Levarisa, a squalid mudflat ruled by warring gangs where sanitation consisted of flying saucers, bundles of waste wrapped in newspapers and flung into the surrounding canals. Emmett liked the tumult of city life, the garish jeepneys, the babble of dialects, the men throwing dice in the alley. He wore his geniality as a shield and was quick to make friends. Drawn to commerce more than to school, he spent his youth in traffic, hawking newspapers and cigarettes. Then in his early 20s, he landed his first real job, cleaning a government pool. He was walking home with his first paycheck when he spied a beautiful young woman in the alley, ironing clothes. Tita had no interest. She considered him plain-looking and poorer than a rat, but Emmett's persistence carried the day. They married in 1967, and 5 children followed in alliterative fashion: Rolando, Rowena, Rosalie, Roldan, and Rosalier. Rowena, Rosalie's older sister, was born with a heart defect that left her perpetually weak and in need of medicine that Emmett couldn't afford. After years of fretting over her frail health, Emmett dropped to his knees and asked God to make a decision: take her or let him have her. God answered in a mysterious way. Soon after, Emmett got an offer to work in Saudi Arabia. He'd be away from his family for 2 years in an Islamic autocracy where stories of abused workers are rife, but he'd earn 10 times his Manila pay. He accepted on the spot. By the time I arrived, 7 years later, Emmett was on his third contract. Rowena had her medicine, and the house was one of the few in Leverisa with a toilet. I'd found my place among the poor, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with them, and they weren't sure what to do with me. Language gaps and excessive politeness kept Tita and me strangers for a few days. Then she enlisted my help with a gluing project, turning newspapers into paper bags. I botched the job so badly, she laughed and threatened to mark them Made in USA. Half her life revolved around drudgery. I'd be on my floor mat before dawn, hearing her boil the breakfast rice. I'd be back there again at midnight, listening to her wrestle the laundry. But the other half revolved around slum solidarity. As a member of Sister Christine's Uplift group, Tita was deeply involved in a program of Bible studies and livelihood projects meant to answer the question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were a squatter? As a manager of the co-op store, Tita was responsible for distributing 2,000 eggs a week, which she stacked under a fluorescent light in the kitchen to keep away the rats. Between chores, Tita told me she'd been asking God a question. Why, if you love your son, are so many Filipinos poor? It's the central question of faith. Why does God, being omnipotent, allow suffering, and one with special meaning in a place that suffers as much as Leverisa? I asked her what God had answered. Not yet, she laughed, as if mocking her own presumptuous attempt to fortify her faith. I'm not sure what I expected to find in the Manila slums, but it wasn't a woman in a worn housecoat trying to live out the gospel beneath a tower of eggs. Rosalie was Tita's main helper, a shy, dutiful girl who always got cast as a nun in the youth group plays. If you were going to pick a girl with the drive to escape Leverisa, you probably wouldn't have picked Rosalie. Others seemed stronger or more outgoing or more academically gifted. The B's she made in high school showed no special academic promise, but the most telling line on Rosalie's transcript wasn't her grades. Through 4 years of poverty and literal revolution, she never missed a day. About high school is where I got grit, she had said. The surest way for a Filipino woman to advance was to become a nurse. The U.S. had established the country's first nursing schools during the colonial occupation. Filipinos trained in English on an American curriculum, and over the decades, thousands had migrated to the States. Nursing school was a leap for a girl from the slums, but Rosalie made it. Then an uncle returned from Saudi Arabia and said a hospital near Mecca was hiring. On her second contract in Saudi, Rosalie met her husband, Chris, a tall, handsome Filipino man working in a Jeddah factory. They courted secretly to avoid the religious police and married in the Philippines. Family logistics got complicated. A daughter followed, then a job in Abu Dhabi, then another daughter, and then a son. Although Rosalie and Chris worked in Abu Dhabi, the kids mostly lived in the Philippines with Tita and Emmett, back on a family farm where they had moved after leaving Leverisa. The parent-child separation was supposed to be a short-term arrangement until Rosalie got a job in the States. It lasted for 8 years. Rosalie and I kept in touch, but we didn't see each other for 2 decades. Then I went back to write a story about the family for the New York Times Magazine. The light bulb moment for me in understanding the importance of migration was learning that remittances, the sums that migrants send home, are 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. Migration is the world's largest anti-poverty program. If you think that poor people should do more to help themselves, migrants do. No country does more to promote migration than the Philippines, where the government trains and markets overseas workers and presidents celebrate them as heroes. Migration is to the Philippines what cars once were to Detroit, the civil religion. The paper sent me to explore migration's effect on Philippine culture, but I worried that the story might be too subtle for an outsider to grasp. Then I rode past the Philippine Central Bank, where the year's remittance tally was strung up in Christmas lights. The story wasn't subtle. A 250 million migrants have spread out across the globe, and they support a population back home as big, if not bigger. But what characterizes modern migration isn't just its size, but its ubiquity. Ireland has its first African-born mayor. Mongolians do scut work in Prague. Every country's story differs, but the underlying forces are much the same. Rich aging countries need workers. Workers in poor countries need jobs. Cheap travel speeds the migrants' journeys, and instant communication spreads word that opportunity awaits. Captured by the sweep of the migration story, I decided to expand the magazine article into a book built around Rosalie and her family. But I encountered one problem. It was a story about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi, a subject whose relevance to American life seemed peripheral at best. Then a month after I committed to the project, the narrative gods smiled. Rosalie got a job in Texas. I met her in Manila and we traveled to Galveston. Things got off to a rocky start. She came expecting Disney World and wound up in a declining blue-collar town with a vista of vacant lots. The cost of living was higher than she expected. American English was harder to understand. When someone suggested we grab lunch at a little hole in the wall, Rosalie looked alarmed. Hole in the wall, she said. The hole in the wall served poor boys. She took me aside. Why not poor girls? She asked. World travelers aren't always worldly. Rosalie had worked abroad for nearly 2 decades, but always in a cocoon of Filipinos. There's Tagalog Mass in Abu Dhabi. Homesick, she retreated into the familiar. There are 7,641 islands in the Philippines, and Rosalie's apartment became the 7,642nd, with purple yam in the refrigerator and Tagalog soaps on TV. The first place that Rosalie felt comfortable was in the hospital. Not because the work was easy, but because she felt equal to its difficulties. Work for her became a vehicle of assimilation. One reason I think why America has generally had better luck with assimilation than Europe is that immigrants here tend to have higher employment rates, and it connects you to, it's a way of connecting to the society. One thing to emphasize about Rosalie's work is that she didn't take an American job. She filled a job that the hospital had been trying to fill for years. In doing so, brought an important service and improvement to her community's medical care. Another thing to note is that Rosalie's a really good nurse. The hospital gave me a pair of scrubs and permission to follow her around the ward. But the most telling testimonial came from a Walmart produce aisle. Rosalie was grocery shopping one day when a former patient rushed up and grabbed her and said, "Remember me?" Rosalie's blank look made it clear she did not. "GI bleed," the woman said. "Bad GI bleed." Rosalie brightened. "Room 13. It had been 6 months. The woman had no idea who I was, standing there in the produce aisle, but she turned to me and gushed. She said, "You can just tell she really loves to take care of people. It wasn't like this is just my job." I heard that a lot. One patient recalled waking up from surgery and looking at Rosalie's face. "I just remember thinking she's got the kindest eyes," the woman said. Another told me, "It's like she feels your pain." One night, a delusional man tried to climb out of bed, tangled up in wires and protective boots. It took 5 nurses to restrain him. One nurse complained he had hurt her hand. Another asked if I now understood how hard they had to work for their money. Someone else said, "Just leave him. He'll be back there in just another 10 minutes. It wasn't Rosalie's patient, but Rosalie broke the impasse. She was the one who called the resident, woke her up, and insisted she come change his medication, which quieted him for the night. Given the political concern that immigrants take jobs, I wondered if her patients harbored any resentment. I started making a point of asking, in private. Not one did. They noticed her care, not her ethnicity. If anyone would resent her, I thought it might be an elderly African-American woman who told me she had always wanted to be a nurse herself but had never gotten beyond minimum wage work as a nursing aide. How did she feel about foreigners getting the job she wanted, I asked. Although she was black and Rosalie was Filipino, she said she considered them part of the same clan, the tribe of low-born strivers. "I admire everybody and anybody that tries to get up a little higher," she said. "Don't stop. Keep trying." 6 months after Rosalie arrived, the family followed. Christine was 9, Laura was 7, and Dominique was 6. After years apart, they weren't just learning to live together in a new country. They were learning to live together, period. They hadn't lived as a family in many years. The kids assimilated rapidly, but in surprising and contrasting ways. Christine, the eldest, assimilated instantly to the popularity-seeking ways of middle school girls, snapping selfies by the thousands and posting them on Instagram. "She's Americanizing," her teacher affectionately groaned. Laura was Americanizing too, but with a special gift for combining her Filipino and American selves. I traced the arc of Laura's assimilation through a story about Laura Parks, about Rosa Parks, which I think Laura has long forgotten. When she first arrived in second grade, a teacher called Rosa Parks a hero. But the idea of a hero in handcuffs made no sense to a little girl straight from the Philippines, where children are admonished to respect their elders and obey authority. She didn't listen to the policeman, Laura said, so she couldn't be a hero. And besides, heroes wear capes. A year later, Laura announced, apropos of nothing at dinner one night, "I sort of agree with Rosa Parks. She'd paid her money like everyone else, so it wasn't fair for her to sit in the back of the bus. But what Laura admired wasn't just Parks's principles, it was also her politeness. When the policeman arrested her, she didn't say any bad words. For an immigrant deftly blending cultures, Rosa Parks became the civil rights hero who didn't curse." The point about blending cultures goes beyond Laura. Studying 3,000 kids in New York City, the sociologist Phil Kasnitz and his colleagues found that children of immigrants on average outperformed the children of native-born peers. And they did so despite having parents with less money and education. So how could this be? The Kasnitz group argued that children of immigrants enjoyed a second-generation advantage. Two parts of their theory are familiar. One is that immigrants, self-selected for ambition, pass along their drive. Another is that ethnic networks committed to each other offer immigrants advantages that natives lack. But the Kasnitz group also cited a third factor, arguing that children of immigrants benefit from living at a cultural crossroads. They can combine the best of both worlds, their parents and their peers. Laura was second generation personified. Her Filipino traits included her manners, her faith, her close family bonds, and from the U.S. she got a reduced sense of class and gender constraints and a license to ask questions. Nothing in Philippine life had encouraged her to probe. On the contrary, Filipino children are taught to obey their elders, not interrogate them, and her classroom, which had 70 kids, had little time for raised hands. But American teachers loved questions, and Laura obliged. "Do fish sleep?" she asked. "Is the Leaning Tower of Pisa ever going to fall? Do nurses have to be caring? Maybe I'll just be a doctor." Curious how she had grown curious, Laura formed her own assimilation theory. New to the country and afraid of having to repeat second grade, I told myself I should be interested right now. Being interested became a habit. Or put differently, life at the cultural crossroads had encouraged new ways of thinking, just as the sociologist had said. One day we stopped for an after-school snack and Laura sprang a sneaky question. "Do you know how to infer?" I frowned, trying to remember. "I'm going to teach you," she said. She paused to dip her French fry in her Oreo McFlurry and increase the suspense. "It's like when you say, 'Oh, it's cold, it's really snowy outside.' I didn't tell you what season it was, but you can infer it's winter." She marked the triumph by stabbing the air with a milky fry. "You see, it works." After 2 years in the States, the foreign nurses finished their contracts and got hired as permanent staff. Pay raises and permanent status ignited a real estate boom. 6 of the Filipino nurses bought houses in the same subdivision, and 3, including Rosalie, shared a cul-de-sac. After just 3 years in the United States, that badge of belonging, a house in the suburbs, was hers. A month later, Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign with an attack on immigrants, whom he called criminals, terrorists, welfare cheats, a threat to jobs, wages, housing, schools, tax bills, and general living conditions. He offered the cheering crowds a parable about immigrant treachery he called the snake. Rosalie wasn't a snake. She was a nurse. In standard cost-benefit terms, her move was a triple win. Good for her patients, good for the family she supports in the Philippines. But cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do her story justice. Rosalie's escape from Leverisa is a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It respected her talent. It rewarded her sweat. It enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place where people go to make dreams come true. I asked Rosalie how the new house compared to the hovel where we met, with the leaks, the rats, the heat, the crowds, and the stench. "Oh my God," she told the kids, "big difference. Mommy grew up in a shanty." Christine's response paid homage to Rosalie's success. "What's a shanty, Mommy?" Thank you. In working on this project for as long as I have, I've accumulated more debts than I can ever repay. But I'd like to offer special appreciation to a couple of people who are here tonight. My friend Ann Holbert has been coaxing this project along since I first got the idea of going to Asia. And my friend and editor at the New York Times, Elizabeth Bumiller, along with Dean Baquet, generously gave me the time it took to finish, long after others would have thrown me to the winds. I'm more grateful than they know. And above all, I'd like to thank the Villanueva family for a friendship of 32 years. Telling their story has been among the great honors of my life and also one of the greatest pleasures. I'm thrilled that they came tonight, and I'd like to introduce Rosalie, Chris, Christine, Laura, and Dominique. Stand up, guys. Brad tells me if there are questions, please use the mics.
Anybody else? No? Well, that was excellent. Thank you. In your book, do you mention that the Filipinos had a certain advantage in immigration? Because, the Philippines is the only colony the U.S. has ever had, and so the medium of instruction in the schools is in English, and the Filipinos grow up on American books, music, movies, literature, and everything. So for a Filipino to immigrate, it would seem to be a lot easier than someone from somewhere else. So do you take that into account?
I think that's generally true. I think in a certain way, Filipinos are pre-assimilated. They come exposed to American life more than people in some other situations. Yes, I agree.
All right, thank you. I'm just curious, in writing a book like this, how do you balance kind of specificity and generalization? Because it's ostensibly about both a group of individuals who obviously meant a lot to you in your life, but then there's also a notion of how do you sort of write about a particular group of people and how do you write about a subject? And I imagine that was something of a difficult balancing act to pull off. So I'm just curious as how you thought about that, or did you just really figure I'm going to focus on these people and sort of they're described as characters in the inside flap, which is always kind of interesting. But or did you just delve into their lives and figure the generalization will work itself out?
I found the family before I found the subject of migration. I was captivated by their courage, resilience, grace, strength, humor in the face of just awful shantytown poverty, and wanted to write about that before I had any notion that global migration was on the rise. I mean, this was 1987 when I met them. The migration part, dawned on me slowly, really as the second generation began to migrate. So when I first met them, of course, it was just Emmett who was in, the father who was in Saudi Arabia, and only later did the 5 kids all grow up and become overseas workers too. So the migration part kind of filled itself in. But to me, the heart of the story was always the spirit that they brought to the tribulations of their poverty.
And just when did you have a sense then of when this was going to be a book? Like, did you know when you first met them that, hey, this is so compelling? Or sort of given sort of the expansion of it, when did you think, what did that strike you?
I went back to the Philippines in 2007 and wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine about them and the rise of global migration. So I thought then that it had the potential because there was a lot more about migration I wanted to explore, but I couldn't figure out how to make it directly relevant to American life because it was about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi. And then I finally decided, well, I don't care if it's relevant to American life. I just want to do it. So it's going to be my esoteric project. And Rosalie got a job in Texas. So thank you, Rosalie.
Jason, hey. What do you want the lesson of this book to be in this cultural and political moment that we're living in?
I think it's that I want Americans to feel good that people want to come to our country and be successful here, and that we can continue to draw the best of the world, by and large. Not always. No one, no family can stand for 44 million, but we're in such a sour frame of mind and seeing immigration as a threat that I think we've forgotten that immigration is a compliment. It's good when people want to come to your country and people see that this is a place where they want to make their dreams come true. It's good for us. It's good for them. It's good for us. It's good.
Hey, Jason, just to follow up on that question, you're providing a sort of counter narrative to the Trump narrative in this book, which I think we all welcome. And
It wasn't
are also,
the intention, but
no, but I know you're a journalist. You don't want to say that. But my point is just
Donald
but
Trump
you
was
are,
the last thing on my mind in 2012 when Rosalie moved to.
But the book itself presents this narrative of exactly what you said, people who want to come here who end up contributing a lot here, and it's a win-win all the way around. But that's a narrative that has been very hard to get traction in the face of the anti-immigration sentiment of this president and his supporters. And I'm just wondering if you think there's a way that the narrative you're describing, the message you say you want the book to provide to people, can somehow rise to a kind of political narrative that gains traction in this country, since most people in this country are immigrants in one form or another.
My thought about that is that so much of the conversation is dominated by the crisis at the border, the humanitarian crisis, and unauthorized immigration, that we've lost track of the legal immigration story. And 3/4 of the people who are here, if you imagine that there was no illegal immigration, there'd be a huge story that journalists should be out covering. What are these tens of millions? How are they going to affect our life? How are we going to affect their lives? How is this wave of? If you think about the Ellis Island generation and all the many ways that changed American culture and economy, this would be a big story. But we've completely lost track of it because we're covering the border. So I hope maybe in a way it can steer some attention back to legal immigration, which now Asians now outnumber Latinos among new immigrants coming into the country. They have for a decade. Almost half the new immigrants are college educated. Half the immigrants in the country live in the suburbs. It's a very different story than the one that dominates news coverage. I think if anybody has any questions for Rosalie, she might be willing to answer one. Or the kids.
No, go, you go.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would like to address my question to Rosalie and her family. What is your reaction to all this? If you can just express it in your own way, any of you.
You want to use the microphone?
Thank you.
This one.
Thank you for coming in this event. Actually, I'm really so shy. Shy. I think I'm starting to have a migraine. Oh my God, this is my first time that I'll be having like this in front of many people. I used to have in my patient only. But
That's your reaction?
yeah, thank you, Kuya Jason, for writing this book. It's not an expecting a lot of people, but thank you for coming.
Well, I don't want to put Rosalie through anything more. Maybe Chris wants to feel this question. What was it like having this guy hang around your family?
You don't need to answer that. You need to use the mic.
2007. Okay, 2007 when after 20 years we didn't met again. So we met in Abu Dhabi, and he made the magazine, and I think delivered from Dominic. We had a picture in the beach in Abu Dhabi, and then he made this magazine. I was so shy, and I was still dreaming of coming to US, and my face already in the US. So now this is the book with our presence here, and just expecting, and thank you. I called Kuya just like a brother. It's in Tagalog, to Kuya Jason. So I was still 15 years old when I met him, and still our friendship never ends. It's like a family to us. So when he started to tell me about the book, I was so I never expect this kind of big book. I thought it's just a regular, it's a huge one. So and I felt like sometimes Kuya is he question a lot of things, and especially dates, and if I never expected I will my our life will be, and he was so specific about the dates, and and I said so hard to remember, and it's some old pictures, and my father who was I was 8 old. My father went to Saudi Arabia. There's no social media then. My father, I will see him again after 2 years of his contract. So it's so too long to see your father again. I was making a letter and making a voice tape, cassette tape before. And sometimes my father, when he answered after 2 months, probably to reach us to get our answer from our questions from him, and sometimes he will put $100 to the cassette tape, and when we open the cassette tape there's money. So that's and now I never thought I would be also a overseas Filipino workers, and I never thought also of going to United States. When I was studying nursing in the Philippines, I said I don't have family in the US, so it's really impossible. But thanks God with our faith that my mother I used, because my mother used to cuddle me to go to the church, and we're praying for my sister who has a congenital heart disease. We usually go to Saint Martin and pray that give her another life, because she did not have any surgery in her heart. So God answered prayers, and it's a lot of miracle that God had given me. Thank you, Lord. That's all.
To follow up quickly on something that Rosalie said, so the first generation who went was mostly the men, and the second generation Filipinos who went were largely women. By the mid 90s, 3/4 of the people who were going abroad were women. Migration feminized in part because the work feminized. That initially, this was in the Persian Gulf. Men were building, they were doing construction work, laying roads, and then once they got the hospital built, they needed nurses and nursing aides to run them, and they needed nannies and domestic workers. So the composition of the migrant stream changed. As migration feminized, it also digitized, because Rosalie referenced social media. So when her father went, it literally could take a month to get an answer to a question. The father would make a tape or write a letter and ask something and get back a month later. Well, by the time Rosalie and her cousins went, communication was instantaneous. So there's a chapter in the book that talks about Rosalie's cousin, Mary Tess, who we called the Facebook mom, because she was in Abu Dhabi raising somebody else's kids while her own kids were in the Philippines, and she was on Facebook with them all the time, day and night. She could know what they had for breakfast every day. So they would a constant stream of chat going back and forth. So it really changed the migrant experience.
I'd like to direct this question to one of the daughters, either Christine or Laura. Jason said something about enjoying the best of both worlds. Bringing the Philippine values here and also learning about American values. What is it that you have learned or discovered about America that you didn't know before, And how do you see yourself, like your mom, contributing and making a difference in this country?
That's a big question. You okay?
Yeah. I feel like that my family's story is very well for me since like we've come so far. It's uplifting. It gives you motivation and um
What parts of you are American and what parts of you are Filipino?
oh the biggest thing is having to question everything. My mom hates questions, so like we're so we're always like, Mom, why do we have to do that? And she's like, just do it because I tell you to. And like we don't understand it, and then so we
She
get
says look it up on the Google, right?
yeah. And then there's a lot of things that are different. Like we have our own opinions, and in Filipino culture that's kind of it's kind of like some of the things are like disrespectful, but we talk about it. And my mom's like, when I was a kid, that I would never question my mother, and we would. So that's that's a big difference.
Do you remember asking your mom what's a shanty?
No, I don't remember asking her, but I still don't know what shanty means.
That's a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
One of the one thing that happens when you write about kids in second, third, fourth, fifth grade, and it takes a few years to publish, is they've forgotten what's happened. So I think they're reading these stories a little bit like they're reading about other people. Laura's description of Rosa Parks was like the biggest thing that happened to me that whole year, and she has little memory of it. Hey, John.
Hey, I'd just like to ask Rosalie a little bit about her work. What kind of a nurse are you? What sort of patients do you see? And how would you compare, say, the hospital you work at in Texas with what you encountered in Abu Dhabi and in the Philippines?
Okay. I'm working in a medical floor unit, med surge, adult patient, and mostly of my colleagues were we came here like from the um, agency, and they took us here until I finished my contract under them, and then we were uh, absorbed by the hospital. Um,
Is the healthcare better here or in Abu Dhabi? That's part of what John was asking.
uh, in terms of work wise, it's just the same. Like you're working in the same human being, you deal with the same patient with the same problem, but it's just more on. Oh yeah, I think the pay is much different, and the opportunity also for nurses to work to work to other hospitals, and there's more freedom here when it comes to working conditions, and freedom as a nurse to be independent, to be and people are more uh, active and participative in their treatment care plans. So
They
kind
ask
of
more
adjusting to ask more questions, and you have to educate. But because in our unit, when I came here, my manager is a Filipino also, and most of the my colleagues in the unit, we were are also Filipinos in our unit, so kind of not hard to adjust initially. It's just from the policy and procedures of the hospital that we have to adjust. Also, um, people I was so amazed when people are so appreciative of the care that they're given to them, and when I got the feedback to the patient, uh, it boosts your your sense of being a nurse, that you're respected when they appreciate a lot.
I loved following Rosalie around the hospital. She worked 7 to 7 overnight shift. And there's just something that happens in the middle of the night between really sick people and caring nurses. It's just marvelous to witness. Despite whatever gaps of gender or class or ethnicity or nativity or whatever, Rosalie has a spirit that bridges those gaps, and people just confided in her and often wanted to pray with her, not initiated by her, but by them. I was trying to describe it to my friend Henry Brinton, who's here tonight, and saying it was something about like bearing witness to people's pains. There was just something really moving about it. And he told me a story about Ionian pilgrims when they go on pilgrimages, look for places. They look for what they call thin places, where the distance between heaven and earth narrows, and you can feel the presence of God more strongly. And that's how I felt in Ward 7B. There was just something really special about being there. And it was that way for me. I think it was different for Rosalie because she was actually doing the work. And it's really hard work. I mean, maybe there's some nurses here, but physically grueling work. So one night, day shift comes in at 6:30 in the morning. A doctor comes in and starts asking Rosalie about something happened with a patient. And she goes like this, head first down. She just passes out right on the counter. They grab her. They take her back in the break room, and there's a bunch of nurses rushing around her, and I had to wheel her out in a wheelchair. She was so exhausted from her overnight shift. Load her into the car. She's in the back seat with her legs up to get the blood flowing back to her head. She went home and slept and came back and went to work the next day. Do we have time for one more
Anybody else?
question for anyone?
One thing maybe, Jason, you could talk about is something that we were talking about before we came out, which is now that you've gotten so involved in the migration story, you see migration influencing so many other factors around the world. I mean, you just touched on the size of the remittances as a sort of migration as a factor for economic development. But talk about how migration permeates so much else going on.
It's often the story behind the story. So here's an example. California, there's was having a big fight over school bond issues. And you wouldn't immediately think of a fight over school bond issues as a migration issues, but part of it was that elderly white families didn't want to pay extra taxes to support expand the school system and support the education of what were largely migrant families. So it was a demographic factor behind it. And stories, it seemed like that. I found hidden elements of that in almost everywhere I looked. Western Union had almost gone bankrupt, and it did go bankrupt in the 1990s, trying to sell telegrams, and it reinvented itself as a remittance company, and actually became a force, not just a neutral force as a business off of migration, but as a force promoting migration, because it was part of their business model. The more migrants, the more people send, the better it is for their business. So Western Union was involved in political behind the scenes lobbying around the world. Same with music, with sports, with politics. There was so many different migration elements behind it.
Yeah, one more.
Okay. Thank you all. It's very inspiring. I'm curious for Jason or the family if, in addition to the hardships that are inherent with moving around the globe and resettling, if you experienced any prejudice or Jason, if you witnessed any due to race or because of being an immigrant family.
In my workplace, I don't experience, because our hospital is a zero tolerance for bullying and racial discrimination. So nobody is allowed to do that. So I don't know.
You're forgetting one incident. There was
for patients we got, okay, because we cannot control patients. We're dealing we are very absorbable with all kinds of treatment to us, so we just take it as I take it as a as I don't take it negative, but I just say that probably this patient has a lot of things going on with his health, that if some patient doesn't want Asian, they want only some people in our unit that want to work. We respect that. So it's just but sometimes if they don't have any choice, but we are all Asians in the hospital who work in the unit, you don't have any choice. But
What about with the nurses, the American nurses that you're forgetting? So I'll only let Rosalie tell the story, but just for the context here, the Filipinos were working one shift and they handed off to the Americans in another shift. And the Filipinos love to talk Tagalog. It's like a guilty pleasure. It's a cigarette break. They slip into the back room and talk Tagalog, and it's like a physical sense. It makes them feel better, and it drives the Americans crazy because they think they're talking about them. So certain tensions began to develop over this, and the Filipinos have a phrase for an idiom when they get tired of talking English. They say they get a nosebleed. And one of the American nurses heard the Filipino saying she was getting a nosebleed from talking English. She got very indignant. What, English isn't good enough for you? You get a nosebleed when you talk English? And it turned into a thing, right? So what happened? Tell the story.
there was some incidents that maybe miscommunication with this Filipino nurse and another nurse, and until it reached the HR, and
She
they
reported to HR for speaking Tagalog,
yeah,
right?
they called us and they told us again, and there were series of meetings with HR and asking us how we're dealing again, and they made us sign a paper regarding the policy of HR about this kind of
But
incidents.
not speaking Tagalog.
Yeah.
But you weren't speaking it to the patients. You were just speaking it to each other.
Yeah, we're speaking
Private.
in the break room, so it's kind of we're having our break, so everybody was just having time from speaking English. It's kind of
Why do you say you get a nosebleed?
because it's not natural for you if you came from you were born here, so it's much easy for these kids that they're already adjusted, so for us that on adult already that we're talking, so it's easy to talk in your language.
So I sat down with the nurse who was the main complainer about the American nurse who was really upset about the Filipino speaking Tagalog, and she really just unburdened herself about her upset and the thing about the nosebleeds. And I thought she was heading towards the story was going to be that this experiment in hiring 24 nurses has been a terrible mistake, and the hospital would have been better off without them. And instead, as soon as she kind of vented about all this stuff about speaking English, she pivoted and started talking about what a great group of nurses they were, Rosalie especially. She would let Rosalie take care of her anytime, what an addition they had been to the hospital, how they needed new, fresh blood, as she put it, that the hospital had grown too insular. So, I ended up with an interpretation of it that it wasn't a deep incident of racial division. It was more just every workplace has its irritant, and this happened to be the one there. And actually, they kind of liked each other despite it all. So, thanks very much.